In Pokrovsk, in eastern Ukraine, the war has turned into a hunt amid drones, ruins, and trenches. This is the story of Pronin and Vampir, two Ukrainian soldiers who spent months surrounded by the Russian advance, surviving FAB bombs, FPV drones, grenades, and infantry assaults. It's not a story of glory, it's a story about fear, resilience, and the struggle to survive in modern warfare. The Russian walked hunched between the Ukrainian trenches, searching for enemies inside the holes. His body was tense. Sweat almost made his hands slip on the rifle. It took him a long time to get there, and after the tough journey surviving the drones, he was finally at his objective. But the Ukrainian heard him first, firing a burst that knocked him to the ground. The defending soldier didn't want to give the attacker a chance. He took a risk by leaving cover to finish him off. The Russian, making sure he would no longer be a threat in the ongoing attack, was followed by the next one, who almost met the same fate as his comrade. He avoided the other Russian's body and fired at the Ukrainian using his PKN. Even with all that firepower, he had to reassess. His position was precarious, very exposed among the trees. The Russian walked away, crouching down in the trench to catch his breath and inform his superiors where he was. When he saw the drone above, he waved, perhaps thinking it belonged to his side supporting the attack, or perhaps simply resigned to what that drone would send his way. The Russians started walking again through the trench, trying to survive until others arrived or until the drones began the attack on the enemy. But the death that came from the sky had blue and yellow colors, and it descended upon him, ending the Russian assault in a whitish cloud. The Ukrainian soldier Pronin knew he would have to live with this kind of assault as long as he was fighting. He went with his two companions from the 155th Mechanized Brigade to the front in the direction of Pokrovsk. They were tough days of waiting. The armored vehicle that was supposed to take them broke down for a while, but then they eventually went on. Pronin knew the road would be tough. It was very common for drones to watch over the entire route to Zero Line, where the real fighting happened. The soldiers had to quickly jump out of the vehicles when the Russian kamikaze drones came down on them. Sometimes they were simply walking when enemy fire made the ground shake and heated the air around them. Pronin didn't have any glorious mission like the soldiers who were hailed as heroes in assaults on Russian trenches. He would just defend his position. Arriving at the location in March 2025, his body and soul would witness much of the fighting in the region, which would end as terribly as it began. The Ukrainians had been trying to stop the Russian advance against the city. When Pronin arrived in Pokrovsk, the Russians were still attempting armored assaults, something that would change over the course of his time in the war. The drones blew up those armored vehicles, leaving the twisted steel to bend more and more as the ammunition inside exploded. The soldiers' bodies were scattered around. The drones kept working along that route, destroying armored vehicles and killing soldiers. Pronin already felt the pressure of battle in the first weeks, gradually realizing the strain of holding his position under bombardment. The Russians were taking several villages in the direction of Pokrovsk. In one of them, they sent their special forces to take trenches, exactly the kind of attack that produced heroic videos that brought fame. The place was near Odradno, and there more of the crimes would occur that no longer shocked as much in the horror of that war. The Russian operators saw smoke rising from the trench. They had already survived the journey and were now inside the enemy's defenses. That didn't make the situation much easier, but every stage they survived was already good news. They needed to be careful. Grenades were still exploding in the trench. The Ukrainians had not given up defending themselves, but the Spetsnaz were relentless, slowly surrounding the enemy. Some of them were confident. Walking over the trench, even under fire, they threw grenades into the Ukrainian shelters, clearing the way for the assault to continue. The grenades flew toward the defenders. They resisted the pressure in the midst of so much gunfire. The soldiers who had arrived at Odradno were not an ordinary assault group. They were more skilled. Even though the Russian special forces had been so poorly utilized and depleted by their own command, the Russians finally managed to get close to the shelter. Their leader, Kask, was using a standard M4 rifle. He used the standard NATO weapon almost like a fruit, firing into the hole to make room for his comrade to throw the grenade. They pulled back before coming back to finish the job. The soldier in front almost made the basic mistake of putting himself in front of the cover without preparing his weapon first. He quickly stepped back and then pulled the trigger. They demanded that the enemies surrender. It was a tense moment. The Ukrainians might still be alive if there had been a curve inside the shelter that could have saved them from the direct impact of the grenade and the gunfire. Finally, tired, they threw down their weapons. But the process still continued until they came out and surrendered. Kask made them lie down and removed their body armor. Then he ordered them to follow while they decided what to do. One of the Ukrainians was wounded, bleeding, and having trouble moving. The shots fired at the ground motivated him. Then they went to check the shelter and concluded that there was no one else there. The Ukrainians cowered, with the rifles pointed at their bodies. Kask reported the situation over the radio. He reported that he had 2 prisoners, one badly wounded and the other an old retiree. The discussion left a clear order: eliminate both of them. Or, in the jargon of war, to zero out the prisoners. The wounded one was useless and could be zeroed out right away, but the other could still be useful. Kask reported that he would interrogate the old man, assuming he should know more about the situation. The Russian realized that one of the Ukrainians had already been executed. Only one other soldier remained seated, resigned, awaiting his fate. The prisoner's name was Nikolai, a soldier from the 23rd Brigade. He said he was 57 years old, had a daughter and a granddaughter. He arrived at the position 4 days earlier and was unlucky enough to be attacked by Spetsnaz. Nikolai couldn't answer where he would be. He would be at the next trench, which irritated the Russian even more. Then they saw there was a drone in the sky, probably Baba Yaga. They all pointed their rifles at the threat, but it was no use. Yes. He remembered it the next day when the intervention was made. Following what? What is this? The danger kept lurking. They finally decided to leave to look for the next target. Kask began giving the orders to leave the trench. The situation with the prisoners still needed to be decided. Grenades and artillery started falling on them. The Spetsnaz leader felt the fragments from the explosion pierce his hand and his leg. Out of impatience, the Russians eliminated the prisoner to move faster toward their next target. The Spetsnaz ran victoriously after capturing another trench, leaving behind the bodies of the defeated Ukrainians. It didn't matter how long the Ukrainian had been there. What mattered to them was winning. Russian bombs fell on Odradno, blowing up the small town on the way to Pokrovsk, just as they had done with so many others. In no time, the place was taken. Pronin knew that the Russians were getting closer and closer to his position. The drones were flying over Pokrovsk more and more frequently, coming down over the houses, blowing up the Ukrainians. The luckiest ones retreated, making way for the Russians. Pronin saw them pass by his position, warning that more waves from Moscow were coming, more and more frequently, until there was no Ukrainian ammunition left. Videos like Karsk's were released by the Russians themselves, clearly showing what could be faced in that war. The conflict was honest in its documentation about the horrors that soldiers would face. Pronin knew that the mission was simply a soldier's routine in war. His survival would not depend only on himself, but also on the drones and artillery trying to stop the Russians. They came slowly along the tree lines, walking in their small groups. Over the months, Pronin noticed that this strategy was starting to gain more traction. Moscow's troops no longer marched in large groups. They walked for miles trying to avoid the drones. Many of them were seen during this movement. The Russians sat down to communicate by radio and barely noticed when the swarm of drones arrived. The explosion was directly over the man's body, detonating the ammunition that set his body on fire. His comrades were nearby. Another Russian's heart was pounding in his chest, but his brain warned him not to move, following the commander's suggestion that if he stayed still, the artificial intelligence wouldn't recognize him. Or maybe the poor drone signal without fiber optics made it harder to be located. But whatever intelligence was controlling the drone, it found the soldier and turned him into the second burning corpse on the tree line. The terrified expression of the third was filmed by the observer drone. He stayed still, trying to camouflage himself in the vegetation. The third kamikaze was already hovering over him, slowly approaching until it detonated over his body in an explosion so strong that it exposed his charred skin. When they reached the trench, they still had to survive the drones trying to protect that position. It was like this all along the Russians' path, walking those kilometers after being left behind by their armored vehicles, dead or even alive. The drones hunted throughout every stage of their movement. The goal was to prevent them from reaching the position of men like Plomin. The corpses were left along the way. The detonations caused injuries in men who would not be able to retire, nor would they be evacuated. Those who didn't die from the detonation suffered until their last strength left their bodies. Russia kept sending its soldiers like this the whole time Plomin was inside the dark basement. He and his companions had placed a wooden board in front of the entrance so that the grenades would slide out. That's because they knew grenades were a common gift for the defenders hiding in the houses of Pokrovsk and in the surrounding villages. The Russians who made it past the drones and artillery walked through the streets handing out grenades. Plomin heard the buildings around him exploding. The enemies were already walking freely through the area. They followed a standard route and systematically threw grenades into any opening they saw. Wells, manholes, and cracks, just to clear the way without knowing for sure if there was a Ukrainian post there. There wasn't a clearly defined zone where the Russians and Ukrainians were. It was all a valley of shadows where it was impossible to tell who was anywhere. Plomin started to realize they were surrounded. Then it happened. The first grenade fell into the hideout. 2 grenades landed on the board outside. The explosions knocked her off. Plomin's 2 companions moved to fix the board. A new grenade fell at their feet. Both were in shock, staring at the explosive until the detonation threw them to the ground. Plomin couldn't do anything. He heard a soldier choking on his own blood. He grabbed the bandages to try to help, but in 15 seconds the man was already dead. The second soldier tried to escape the area. Smoke filled his lungs as he crawled. The Russians threw another grenade. The Ukrainian died immediately. Plomin tried to react, but one of the explosions threw him to the ground where he remained unconscious for hours. When he woke up, he realized that all his smaller belongings, like his flashlight and knife, had disappeared in the dust or had been shattered into pieces. That's when he understood that everything needed to be strictly kept inside the backpack attached to the vest. Otherwise, he could lose everything in the first explosion.
The controversy was loud. Let's go.
The Russians kept moving toward Plomin. The Ukrainian was tired in his hideout. The bodies of his friends were evacuated, but he remained there in that purgatory, waiting for more Russians to arrive while rations and water became increasingly scarce. While he waited, Ukrainian drones hunted the Russians on the road, trying to prevent more of them from getting closer. The hexacopters known as Vampir or Baba Yaga tracked these men. Within minutes, multiple explosives were dropped on the lone bear near the anti-tank ditch. The detonation threw him to the ground. The fragments tore through his left leg. Covered in blood, he rolled into the huge ditch. Another explosion sent blast and fragments into his face, tearing the man's face apart. Inside the hole, the situation got worse. The blast waves from the detonations bounced off the walls, hitting the Russian's body even more. He fell unconscious, motionless as the last explosive was dropped over his head. The assault groups also helped Pronin. They hunted down the nearest Russians, slowing the rate at which they were taking over the area. They threw grenades where the enemies were hiding. The approach was slow, but it gave time for one of the Ukrainians to aim a grenade launcher into the shelter. The detonation set the place on fire. One of the Russians tried to escape, but the rifles were already waiting for him outside. In July, the heat was so intense in the hideout that Pronin had to improvise. He found a 1.5-meter metal rail and used it as a pickaxe to break the bricks of the basement's inner wall and dig to escape the sun. Water was a problem. The drones tried to send supplies since it was no longer possible to see anyone along that route. Since the small drones missed the target or burst the bottles on the ground, the only solution was the rain. When it rained, all the soldiers on those lines collected every drop of muddy water and used the chlorine tablets that came in the French rations. Pronin drank that chemically purified water to avoid dehydration. Shortly after that, Vampir joined him. It was still summer, and the two of them would still see more of that hell together. Vampir was as young as Pronin. The worsening situation in Pokrovsk would eventually bring the two together. However, before that, he would still witness much despair. Vampir arrived in July in a much more comfortable position. He was in charge of the spot where the steel shelter was located, with a generator, Starlink, and heavy weapons like the Brownie and MK. By that time, Pronin had already been in the combat zone for 3 months, experiencing Russian bombers firsthand. The FAB bombs often fell in groups of 4. The attack configuration of the main aircraft used by Russia for this purpose, the Sukhoi Su-34 fighter bomber, allowed it to carry up to 4 500 kg bombs, 2 on the wings and 2 on the central fuselage. The 4 bombs were released in a quick salvo with fractions of a second between them, maintaining the aircraft's balance and overwhelming the Ukrainians. The bombs landing on target imposed a total suppressive effect, leaving the remaining defenses stunned by the acoustic trauma and material devastation. On a certain day, a drone fell in front of Vampir's hideout without exploding. There was little they could do because if they left the place, the operator could detonate the threat. They kept watching until the Russians themselves showed up. The grenade they threw blocked the access, raising a cloud of debris. Vampir fired into the smoke and dust. He couldn't see anything. He just knew he couldn't stand still waiting for the Russians to get closer. When the shooting stopped, Vampir knew that what they least wanted had happened. Their position was confirmed to the Russians. The drones started coming down shortly after. The explosions made the walls shake. The Russians kept sending kamikaze drones. Vampir had to crouch down with his squad while hell kept erupting outside, threatening to wipe them all out. With each explosion, he felt the vibrating air pass over his skin. Debris flew in the form of dust and small fragments that cut through his uniform and face. He was already half deaf and almost hopeless when the danger ceased. The drones completely destroyed Vampiro's position. He ran, and when the remaining soldiers in the area gathered, he found Pronin. They were practically surrounded by the Russians. When winter arrived, most of Pokrovsk had already been taken. The city was almost completely cut off, surrounded from the south and from the north. The Ukrainian assault groups tried to stop the invaders. The rifles surrounded the houses where there was Russian advance, shooting until the enemies surrendered.
We're coming out! Hands up, damn it! Get your hands up! Rooster, no rooster, control! On your knees!
It was hard work having to walk slowly with the prisoners under the risk of encountering drones or an enemy squad. They had to go into combat, still having to watch the prisoners behind them. They fired at the enemy shelters, throwing grenades whenever there was space. The rifles couldn't stop. Sparks exploded in the cold air. The soldiers didn't even care if they aimed at specific targets. People. If it's not good, go. They had to fire into the position until they got either bodies or a surrender. Pronin and Vampir saw more and more Russians coming their way. When winter arrived, the first had already been in combat for over 200 days, while the second had been in combat for over 100 days. They didn't even know when there would be a rotation. The world was exploding around them. Russians were being hunted by drones. Meanwhile, the two talked about those months of battle. It was one of Ukraine's tragedies. With few soldiers, some of them stayed at the front for absurdly long periods, deteriorating more and more. There wasn't a soul who recovered from that. The pair became distracted, talking and listening to the explosions in the distance. When they realized it, there was a Russian in front of their position. Strangely, the man surrendered voluntarily to the Ukrainian team, having survived the drone hunt. The Russian said he heard them talking and decided to surrender to escape from his commanders because he knew he was being sent to his death. The Ukrainians treated him well, gave him food and water, and confiscated his radio. Using the captured radio, they began to monitor all Russian communication in the area, acting as an intelligence unit until the signal went completely silent due to a lack of Russian personnel. During one of his movements, Promi ended up finding an RPK H2's weapon. It was much better than the AKMS rifle, whose folding stock wobbled and annoyed him a lot. The new trophy, a Soviet 7.62 caliber light machine gun, served him well when he saw a Russian crawling camouflaged in the grass. Promi could fire up to 600 rounds per minute at the enemies, but he needed less than that to make the Russian bleed. He ran to the spot to confirm the kill, and when he saw that the corpse had an SVD sniper rifle, he realized that it was a sniper getting into position. He was lucky, and he even took another trophy with him, an AK-12. The situation got even more tense when more of those Russians approached, without any intention of surrendering. By that point, Pronin and Vampir had retreated to the trench system in the rear. 6 Russians approached their position under a tense fog that reduced visibility to 30 meters. The firefight that broke out was intense. None of them were tired, but they knew that giving up would mean death. The triggers were being pulled less frequently as the ammunition became increasingly scarce. There wouldn't be time for the drones to deliver more ammunition, not even for them to blow up the Russians. Vampir gave the order to retreat. It would be more urgent. The position was lost, but they would be alive. They began to flee through the ruined city. They withdrew under fire. Luckily for them, 3 mortars that fell in front of them didn't explode. Laughing in the midst of the tense situation, they thanked the North Koreans for the bad ammunition given to the Russians. They saw the Ukrainian trench in the distance. Relief began to fill their hearts when they noticed someone there aiming at them. Startled, Promi slipped and the shot stopped. They grazed his helmet. They laughed about the situation when they managed to get into the trench. Almost dying from friendly fire, Pronin had already been in combat for almost a year. The Russians had almost surrounded them when they received the order to finally be relieved from their task. They left the trench for a new journey. He was already exhausted, walking on painkillers and with his left leg not responding. Pronin heard a heavy FPV drone diving toward him in the final stretch of the escape. Without the strength to run, he waited until the last second of the drone's dive and stepped aside. The drone exploded 2 meters behind his back, slightly injuring his left leg with shrapnel. The Russians took Pokrovsk and continued to expand, but by then, Moscow's advance was no longer the same. They had promised a spring offensive that never happened as expected. The speed of the Russian advance in 2026 was not even a third of what it had been the previous year. The expectation was that this was a preparation, but the Ukrainian offensive against Russian logistics and the low recruitment seemed to be affecting Moscow's troops. For Pronin and Vampir, this was good news they received while recovering in the hospital from wounds their bodies would still feel for a long time and from which their exhausted souls might never fully recover. They had fulfilled their mission for their homeland without glory, without pomp. They were just trivial heroes in a war where death was the only medal many anonymous soldiers received when their bodies were lost among the rubble and fields in Ukraine.